Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I don't know if you've noticed, but archaeology is coming to Minecraft! Actually, it's not only coming to Minecraft, it's already in the snapshots. And because you all are archaeology-minded these days, I'm guessing that you might want to know what an actual archaeologist thinks about it all. Here's a quick breakdown of the archaeology mechanics as they stand in snapshot 23W12A. I know this isn't the latest snapshot, but it's the latest snapshot where archaeology was really affected, so that's what I'm going to talk about today. To do archaeology in Minecraft, you need two things: a brush and either some suspicious sand or some suspicious gravel. A brush can be created with a stick, a feather, and a copper ingot, which makes it fairly simple to get a hold of and gives us a new use for copper. Suspicious sand and suspicious gravel look like regular sand and gravel, but with some slight differences. At the moment, you can find suspicious sand inside desert pyramids, at the bottom of desert wells, and in ocean ruins in warm oceans. And you can find suspicious gravel in ocean ruins in cold oceans and in a new structure called trail ruins, which you can find in taiga, jungles, or birch forests, and usually near rivers or other waterways. When you find suspicious sand or gravel, you can brush it with your brush to get artifacts. A lot of these are things that we already know about, like diamonds or emeralds, but there are also 20 different types of pottery shards that are spread across these 5 site types. If you try to dig suspicious sand or gravel, they don't just give you sand or gravel, they just break, making either a shattered glass noise or a broken pottery noise or something like that. You also can't use silk touch on these blocks, and you can't place a torch under them either. Sus sand and sus gravel are also gravity blocks, so if you mine underneath them, they are gonna fall. But if they fall at all, they break and drop absolutely nothing. Most of the objects we find in suspicious sand or gravel have a use to the player already, but the pottery shards are new. You can use them to build a large pot either by combining 4 shards, 4 bricks, or a combination of the two. And you can also mix and match the shard designs to create a little bit of a story around the large pot that you make. So how does this stack up to actual archaeology, and what do I think about it? I gotta be honest, I'm generally rather impressed with these mechanics, and so are a lot of the archaeologists I know. I do have some things that I would change and some things I'd like to see in the future, but generally I'm very impressed. Let's start with what I really love. I love that you can't pick up suspicious sand or gravel, even with silk touch. I think that's one of the best decisions they could possibly have made. Archaeologists can't easily pick up dirt without disturbing what's inside of it. Technically we can, and we often do for more fragile finds, but it's really difficult to do and takes a lot of people, a lot of equipment, and a lot of skill to pull off well. It's also something that we do very carefully, like I was saying, and often we do it with a lot of reverence, particularly because a lot of what we take out of the ground with the ground still around it are things like funerary remains or fragile objects that are sacred to a lot of people. It's not something we do casually, and I feel like taking the option away for the player to pick up suspicious sand makes it so that it's obvious this is a block that needs to be treated carefully and respectfully. I also love that suspicious sand and suspicious gravel as they currently exist aren't something that you can place yourself outside of creative mode. Now I will get into this because there are some things about this that I would love to see tweaked. I'm not opposed to players using suspicious sand. I just have thoughts on how we should do it. Archaeological contexts, archaeological material aren't decorations, and while I do agree with anyone saying that it would be really cool to create our own archaeological sites, I feel like it needs to be more complex than picking up sus sand or sus gravel and placing it somewhere else. I also really love the sound that sus sand and sus gravel make when you break them. It's just a fantastic reminder that there was archaeology in there, but now it's gone and you can't get it back. I've said before that archaeology is inherently destructive. You can never dig a site twice. Once it's dug, that's it. Archaeology is systematic and careful for a lot of reasons, but one of the biggest ones is because we only get one chance to collect the information we need from whatever we're digging. In fact, we often will only excavate parts of a site so that future archaeological techniques can still be applied to the parts of the site that we haven't excavated yet. Now, you can't put everything into a game, and you probably shouldn't anyway, but I think the fact that you can't move the suspicious sand, you can't pick it up, and the noise that it makes as it breaks are all really fantastic mechanical choices that may seem small, but that communicate major tenets of archaeology as a field. Speaking of teaching major tenets of archaeology through game mechanics, Minecraft now teaches you one of the biggest things in archaeology, and that is stratigraphy. Stratigraphy is actually a geological and ecological concept that looks at layers of rock or soil. So if I have a layer of dirt here, a layer of gravel on top of it, and a layer of sand on top of that, these layers together and how they got there are what we call stratigraphy. Within stratigraphy, we have something called the law of superposition, which states that because gravity exists, generally speaking, a layer that occurs above other layers generally formed after the layers below it did. So with this example here, the dirt formed first, and then the gravel, and then the sand. If I take out the dirt, then the gravel and the sand fall down. You usually can't create a hole here after the gravel and sand have formed and try to put dirt underneath it. There are definitely exceptions to this, like caves for example, and Minecraft actually has very few gravity blocks, so this law kinda goes out the window, but hopefully you get the general point. Even though a lot of Minecraft blocks aren't gravity blocks, we can still see stratigraphy with sus sand and sus gravel, and we can see it at all 5 of the current archaeological sites. Because these blocks are affected by gravity, and because they disappear when they fall, we know that any blocks underneath suspicious sand or suspicious gravel were there before the sus sand or sus gravel formed. So in the case of the ocean ruins, for example, we know that this building itself was here before the suspicious sand formed, and therefore the building is older than the suspicious sand. In many of these sites, we actually get even more to work with. In the desert pyramid, for example, because suspicious sand has formed in a chamber, suspicious sand appears at different Y levels in that chamber. So not only do we know that the chamber was made before the sand filled it in, we also know that suspicious sand at the bottom of the chamber was placed there before any suspicious sand that we find at the top of the chamber. I also really like that you don't always find things that are inherently valuable to the player. Sometimes you get a stick or a wooden hoe. Also, you guys, you can find glass panes in the trail ruins. Ah! My glass specialist self is so happy about this. It's one of those things where, like, every time I find a glass pane here, I'm like a kid at Christmas. It makes me so ridiculously happy. I've seen a lot of posts on social media saying there needs to be more treasure, or the treasure you find needs to be more useful to the player, and I gotta be honest, I disagree. The past does not exist to be useful to the present, and the things that people in the past found valuable aren't going to be the same things that we find valuable today. I do think some of the things players find in sus sand or sus gravel need to have value to the player, because otherwise a lot of players are never going to do archaeology, and that would be a real shame. I just also don't think that every item we find needs to be inherently useful to us as a player. Besides, in excavating this particular trail ruin, I found 67 sus sand and gravel. 67! I only got 66 artifacts because one of them generated with an empty block underneath it, so when I unknowingly mined the stone above it, it fell and broke. But look at the amount of stuff that was in this site. I mean, I guess if you're only looking for armor trims and pottery shards, you might be disappointed with how much digging you need to do to get to those. But if that's the only reason you're doing archaeology, then you're kind of missing the point of archaeology, which isn't your fault. Popular media has made archaeology into this high-stakes big adventure where you find valuable things around every corner every day, and that's just not what archaeology actually is. There are so many stories that we can tell, and details and lore we can decode about the Minecraft world from each and every one of these artifacts and where we found them. Archaeology isn't about loot, it's about uncovering the stories of people in the past and understanding how those stories relate to our own in the present. Archaeologists do a lot of digging and finding absolutely nothing. I once dug a trench that had nothing in it aside from 63 wild onions, and we couldn't even eat the onions because they were a variety that's poisonous to humans. It took me 3 days. 3 days! Also, just to be clear, I am not advocating for Minecraft to have nothing as a possibility when brushing sus sand or sus gravel. When I was chatting with Joel Duggan and Pixelriffs on the spawn chunks, which I've linked to that episode in the description down below, Joel made a really good point that games need to strike a balance between reality and fun. It may be accurate for archaeology to almost always produce nothing or relatively little that feels tangible, but if everybody enjoyed digging for hours on end only to find almost nothing, then archaeology would be a much more popular job. But we also don't want to go so far in the direction of fun that we lose the main tenets of archaeology. I mentioned on the spawn chunks that we don't want to engage in game design that encourages archaeological looting, for example, because that can have real-world effects. People learn things from video games. I worked in museum education for about 20 years, and when I did, kids ages 6 and up generally know, for example, that to get wool off of a sheep, you need to use shears because that's how you do it in Minecraft. Here's another story, in part because kids are hilarious, and in part because it demonstrates the point really well. Whenever I talked about making candles in the past, I would ask the kids what candles are made out of. They would say wax, and I would say, excellent, yes, where do you think we get the wax from? And inevitably, without fail, the first answer was always earwax, which was great because I could praise where their brain was going, but then I could also just walk them through the process of making a candle out of earwax, and that's fun and all, but here's the point. After Minecraft added bees, beeswax, and candles in 1.15, whenever I asked the kids where wax came from, instead of the first answer always inevitably being earwax, the first answer was always inevitably beeswax. So kids learn things from Minecraft, and so do us adults. I did not know that mangrove propagule was called a propagule before it happened in Minecraft. I don't think that everything in Minecraft needs to be realistic, but when it comes to how we as people treat the real heritage of real people in the real world, it's important that the things people are learning from video games are relatively accurate in their respect for and treatment of that heritage. I'm really glad that so far Minecraft is striking a good balance between what is fun and what archaeology actually is. Another critique I've seen floating around is that the trail ruins don't look archaeological, they just look like a jumble of blocks thrown together. As an archaeologist who digs things in the ground and looks at site reports on a regular basis, and as someone who has done a lot of building a site up and then making it fall into disrepair in Minecraft, the trail ruins look exactly like an archaeological site to me. It nails it, hands down. And again, people saying that it's not archaeological, they are incorrect, but it's also not their fault. Popular media and also tourist attractions have made archaeological sites seem like these visible, tangible things that have a certain aesthetic to them. And while there are many sites that are like that, there are many, many sites that aren't. But here, I can see how the ceiling blocks have fallen down in these ruins, how floor blocks have decayed, how staircases have broken or disintegrated. I can see how each and every block got to where it is now. These ruins are ruins, and they are absolutely archaeologically accurate. I've also seen some players saying that the blocks for the trail ruins are too garish, and once again, popular media and the way that sites are presented to the public has given a bit of a false idea of what the past looked like. For example, did you know that many of the marble statues the Romans and Greeks made used to be painted? I have a friend who actually studies the pigments that are still present on Roman-era ruins here in Scotland. Here's a recreation of some of the pigments used on the Bridge Ness distance sculpture, which formed part of the Antonine Wall during the Roman occupation of what is now southern Scotland. Reds and yellows are the main colors that she's found on these stones, and blues, browns, and pinks have been found on Roman sculpture in continental Europe. There are also these examples from ancient Greek sculpture, which have been reconstructed and recolored by Vincenz Brinkmann and Ulrike Koch-Brinkmann. And I can hear some of you thinking, yeah, but that's just the sculpture. But the Romans and the Greeks had painted sculpture everywhere. They were colorful places. The main reason that we see so much of their architecture as such pristine white marble today is because people in the past thought that the remnants of pigments that were on their surface was actually dirt and grime, so they scrubbed all of it off. And these archaeologists have even looked into the specific pigments that were used, so we can make a color palette for these pieces. Here's the palette that the Romans used, here's the palette of the Greek statues that I just showed you, and here's the palette used in the trail ruins. Look at how similar these are. So are those colors something that I personally would put together in a building? Probably not, but that doesn't remotely mean that nobody ever has or that nobody ever will. And a final critique that I've seen is that the materials used in the trail ruins aren't from the biomes that these ruins often spawn in, and they look out of place. That's a valid thing to note, and I agree that they are non-local materials, but rather than thinking that the developers did a poor job, let's assume that that choice was was intentional. Trail ruins are supposed to have those materials regardless of what biome they're in. That alone tells us that these sites in their heyday had a lot of power and a lot of connections. In order to get terracotta from a mesa to the taiga that this site is in, powerful people in the past must have had impressive long-distance trade routes out to groups living in the mesa, or they even had enough resources themselves to maintain a quarry that far away and ship the materials all the way back here. So rather than seeing it as a mistake, I see it as some pretty big evidence that this site was either a major power center or a major trade hub, or honestly, probably both. Now, I do have a few things that I would change, but before we get into that, if you're enjoying the video, could you maybe hit the like button or consider subscribing? It lets me know what content you all enjoy, and it helps a lot more people find these videos. Thanks! Okay, so I know I just praised a whole bunch of the archaeology mechanics and such, but I do have some things that I hope we see in future updates or iterations. Let's start with the things that I would change first. And these are relatively minor, but they're important to archaeologists. The first thing is the pottery shards. I know it's the smallest of changes and probably a bit nitpicky, but I'm really sorry to say that pottery shard is not a term that archaeologists use. We call pieces of pottery potsherds, sherds, or pottery sherds, all with an E. Shards in archaeology are pieces of glass vessels or glass windows. It's a really minor thing, but again, if people are learning this term as associated with archaeology, for the difference of a single letter, it'd be great to use the actual term that archaeologists use. I'm also kind of sad that the main tool we use to do archaeology in Minecraft is a brush. Brushes may feel iconic to the public, but for archaeologists, our main tool is a trowel, and we tend to be rather sentimental about them. But ArchaeoPlays, if a brush is still something archaeologists use, then that's fine, right? Well, yes and no. The reason that we don't use brushes that often is because if there is any moisture in the soil or dirt that you are brushing, then the dirt or soil will actually clump onto the brush and it will smear everything on the ground, which means that we won't be able to see what's actually going on. So it's not just that a brush takes longer, it's that using a brush in most soils actively hurts our ability to figure out what's going on. But what if you need to be super delicate, I hear you asking, and I promise you, you would be surprised how delicate you can be with a trowel, especially if you use one like this, which we often refer to as leaf trowels. We also use a whole lot of spoons. Don't worry, these spoons are not for eating. And we also use a lot of lollipop sticks or craft sticks. I've used a lot more leaf trowels than I've used brushes, and I'd love to see the trowel be the main tool we use in Minecraft. Maybe change the recipe to a stick, a copper ingot, and an iron ingot or something. Trowels could also get added later and maybe have more speed and less dexterity than a brush, but from a player perspective, adding two new tools just to do archaeology feels like a lot of inventory space, so I don't think that that's gonna happen. These two things, calling the pottery shards pottery sherds and using a trowel instead of a brush, are honestly fairly minor. I love this update. These are just some really minor changes that I would really love to see. So what about the future of archaeology in Minecraft? Where can they go from here? I would love to see a suspicious sand and suspicious gravel crafting recipe in the future. I love that we have 5 archaeological sites in Minecraft now, but it would also be wonderful if players could craft and build their own archaeological sites with their own artifacts to find. I don't think we should be able to just craft suspicious sand and have it have the same loot table as naturally generated suspicious sand, but I do think that a crafting recipe that would let us bury an object into sand to create suspicious sand would be really cool. The recipe would need the soil type and an object to go inside, for example, so maybe an object surrounded by sand or an object with 4 gravel in some kind of pattern around it, maybe like the large pots. But that is a lot of resources, and sand currently isn't renewable in Minecraft, so that would probably need to happen before this type of crafting recipe could really work. I'm also really hoping that since archaeology has started appearing in different biomes, that it also appears in different dimensions. Suspicious netherrack or suspicious endstone would be really cool, and the opportunity to give the piglins their own archaeological past by putting suspicious gravel in bastions is just so interesting and wonderful and enticing. I just really want it to happen. The other thing I'd love to see in the future is the ability to copy the patterns that are on the pottery shards, similar to how you can copy the patterns for armor trims. At the moment, players are encouraged to take the archaeology they find in the ground ground and turn it into something useful or decorative for themselves. I don't think that that should go away entirely. Again, I am in favor of balancing fun and reality, but I do wish that there were an option for players who might not want to use the stuff they find in the ground as household decorations, particularly for players who are from communities where looting of archaeological sites, antiquities dealing, and the effects of colonial archaeology are commonplace and still felt. I also wish that we could dye our decorative pots, or that the sherds came in different colors. I suspect that that's something the team are aware of and making decisions on because it seems like a logical step forward, so really I'm just adding my voice to the chorus of people saying yes, please do this. As for the pots themselves, I do love that you can craft a blank one with bricks, and I love that it has a neck that merges with a flower pot so you can put flowers and saplings on it. I also love that its hitbox is only 1 block high even though the neck goes further. So you can stack your pots, or you can put things like trapdoors or carpets or pressure plates on them to make them look like a little bin with a lid instead. So all in all, I think archaeology in Minecraft is pretty great. I'm really excited to see what happens with this and how it grows in the future. I would change a couple of minor things, but overall, I think the team has made some really fantastic decisions with the core mechanics of archaeology. The requirement to treat sus sand and sus gravel carefully, and the audio reminder when it breaks that you've lost something, is beautifully done. And that's honestly probably the hardest thing to navigate when bringing archaeology to a video game. I've talked a lot about archaeology in Minecraft now, but I'm curious what you all think. Are there things that you love about archaeology in Minecraft? Is there anything that you would change or anything you'd like to add? Let everybody know in the comments. Also, if you're curious about how archaeologists find sites like desert pyramids even when they're buried in the sand, check out this video here. That's all from me for today. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye!